Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, there's a lot of medicines that come from controlled drugs, and I actually want to. My main interest here is the way that drugs are controlled, and the way that that does create barriers to research and actually the application of drugs to in therapeutic ways for a lot of people who can use those. Um, but the types of drugs that are available as medicines, typically cannabis now obviously is a licensed medicine that can be prescribed. Diamorphine, which is heroin, is very commonly prescribed for or used for pain control. I don't know if, how many people know, but in the UK we have two systems of controlling drugs. We have the classification system, which essentially is there to determine the punitive sanctions for possession and supply of illicit drugs, the penalties that you'll be hit with if you're caught in possession or you're supplying. Then there's a scheduling of drugs, which is the more interest to me. I think scheduling of drugs determines whether a particular substance has any therapeutic value at all, and what type of controls that those drugs should have according to their therapeutic value and how harmful they may or may not be. And this is an area which is really, I think, causing a lot of problems in the way that we want to develop the therapeutic use of drugs that are currently controlled. You will see that in Schedule 1. And Schedule 1 is where drugs are determined to have no therapeutic value and are very harmful. But the types of drugs that are in Schedule 1 are things like LSD and MDMA. And we know those drugs actually have very little harm associated with them and have huge therapeutic value. And what's interesting is cannabis was a Schedule 1 drug until late 2018. It was descheduled to Schedule 2, which is now why we can prescribe it as a medicine. But nonetheless, there are still lots of controls associated with it being Schedule 2. The barriers that this causes means that it's very difficult to do research on these drugs, because Schedule 1 drugs, you can do research on those, but it takes a huge amount of, there are a huge amount of barriers that you have to overcome. You have to get a special license. You have to keep the drugs in very, very controlled circumstances. It virtually makes it impossible, almost impossible to develop research on those drugs. And that is preventing us from really understanding how these drugs can be used in a therapeutic way. It's a real, it's not based on evidence. It's based on other considerations, I think, and that's a real problem, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And I would say I agree completely with David on all those points. And I would add, I guess David and I both come from treatment backgrounds, don't we? Both used to work in drug treatment.
Yes.
Not together, but kind of a similar time. And I think one of those huge barriers for me has always felt to be stigma, and the stigma that exists around substances and drugs, and how that stigma then can create tension when trying to get this through with policymakers. Because the thing that over my career, I've done a lot of kind of training for different groups, from social workers to police, students, and do a bit of lecturing. And the thing that always raises eyebrows is the fact that so many illicit drugs have medical purposes. Like the most famous and obvious that's used quite frequently is heroin. It's diamorphine. Whenever I do like a training session, I've got a bunch of police officers, social workers, I'll go, so who's had diamorphine? And loads of hands will go up. And you'll be like, oh, cool, okay, so you know what heroin feels like. And they'll be like, what? Like they can't comprehend that this drug that has so much stigma attached to it, and so much fear, and so much assumption, is something that a huge number, most of it, and it's quite a dark thought, sorry to kick things, my contribution off here is a negative dark thought, but most of us probably will experience that at some point, and it will be in pain and require a drug like diamorphine to alleviate it. It's just heroin, but it's that stigma and assumption that if you were to just run that, if you were to call a Daily Mail journalist now and be like, got a great story, it's about how we should reschedule drugs, this, that, and the other, immediately they'd be like, oh, hang on, like the state drugs are dangerous, and that's always felt like such a big stumbling block with this subject.
I was going to add, actually, even fentanyl is actually commonly given to if you're in childbirth, which I only found out about a year ago. But but also to add to that, I mean, obviously, so we wrote a UK review of medical cannabis last year, and that looked at kind of the rescheduling 2 years on, and obviously, despite the rescheduling, we still have lots of barriers to access, and you know, a large part of that is that it was in Schedule 1, which makes research much more difficult. So we've now got to this point where it's been rescheduled really on the basis of 2 young boys with epilepsy, despite the fact that the rescheduling of cannabis was actually recommended by the government's own group at one point 20 years prior. So it was an emotional thing that actually finally made them reschedule it. And now we've got an issue where, you know, in a healthcare setting where we're predominantly, you know, NHS, the data isn't quite there to justify prescribing these cannabis medicines freely via the NHS. So you can now get them via the private market, but they're, you know, very, very expensive. And this is against sort of the backdrop that we're also seeing lots of promise in other controlled drugs. So, you know, psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression has breakthrough status in the US, as does MDMA for PTSD. And we have a campaign and paper looking to reschedule psilocybin to basically say, look, let's learn from the mistakes, you know, with cannabis, where, you know, rescheduling too late, because these studies are about to go into phase 3 trials. And as Dave rightly said, you know, trying to do research on Schedule 1 drugs is near impossible. It's very, very difficult. You can do it, but it adds an enormous amount of cost. So if you're going to run, you know, a phase 3 trial on a Schedule 2 drug, there's still lots of restrictions to prevent diversion and that kind of thing. But it means that if the data continues to be as promising as we think it will be and hope it will be, you know, that drug gets to patients quicker, and it will hopefully be a little bit cheaper as well, because the pharmaceutical companies are not having to recoup the costs that they've spent doing research on a Schedule 1 drug versus Schedule 2. And, you know, we're seeing this, you know, DMT, ibogaine for treatment of addiction. All of these things, all of this sort of therapeutic, you know, potential is coming out of the woodwork in these controlled drugs, which, as Paul said, have been very, very stigmatized. And just because a drug has medicinal value doesn't mean it's not dangerous, i.e. heroin, fentanyl. But certainly all this kind of medical and therapeutic use that's coming to light is kind of challenging our drug laws, both, you know, the classification and the scheduling as well.
And I think we have this kind of ridiculous kind of chicken and egg situation with Schedule 1 at the moment as well, because it's not based on evidence. You know, the drugs that are in Schedule 1 is not based on the evidence that we have. But the argument for that scheduling is, well, these drugs don't have therapeutic value. And so you might say, well, why do you say that? Well, there isn't evidence to show that they do. Well, why isn't there evidence to show that they do? Well, because we can't do research on them because they're Schedule 1. So kind of like, it's just this sickler thing, which is very, very difficult to resolve, simply because of the, you know, this bureaucratic approach to wanting to control these substances and not looking at the evidence that shows, and there's very clear evidence and throughout the world that shows that there is huge potential, therapeutic potential.